as Paul presented just before. But I'm going to give a bit of an introduction and context into the shift from waterfall to agile, which kind of sets us up nicely to talk about DevOps. I'm going to talk a little bit about the key functionality of DevOps, and in particular Azure boards. Talk a little bit around the supplementary tools and integrations that you could use with DevOps, and then at the end, summary and discussion. I just want to say that I've done this presentation as a slideshow. So if nobody asks any questions, it may be a little bit dry. The other thing to note is that I'm based in Liverpool, so we might have the best football team in the world, but my accent can be a little bit difficult. So certainly for our European friends or American friends, if there's any issues with understanding what I'm saying, or you need me to repeat anything, please shout out and I will. Normally I do these sessions as an interactive session, and I'd be jumping in and out of DevOps. As I've said, I've done this presentation as a PowerPoint. If we get time, and if anyone's interested, I can jump into my DevOps sandpit and we can have a little play around. If anybody's got any questions, quite happy to do that. So, in terms of the market and the shift to agile, it seems that agile has become very, very attractive, particularly in the client base. And I think people see a number of things that are attractive about agile. Firstly, it seems that you can get to results quicker. You can almost define your requirements on the go. There's less waiting for design and sign off of those requirements, so you can get started quicker. There's perceived flexibility. So your team have got a bit of leeway to navigate through blockers, and as I've just mentioned, the design of your eventual solution can evolve throughout the project lifecycle. We've got regular communication and teamwork over large structured Gantt charts and daily task lists. We've got a leaning towards self-managing teams with leaders and facilitators over micromanagers. And of course, agile projects are seen as an antidote to some of the issues that we all know with waterfall methodologies, such as the difficulty in knowing exactly what a full list of detailed requirements might be at the start of a project, and therefore how long the project's going to take. There's a bit of a paradox it's interesting to me that whilst people want informality, flexibility, rapid starts, we still kind of tend to view success in traditional terms. So in terms of what a project coming in on time, on budget, and to scope, which is not really the agile way. So I think what most people have ended up with is a bit of a hybrid, taking the best bits from agile, the best bits from waterfall, and kind of smashing those things together. I've heard it called wagile. I don't know if anybody else has heard that term. But these more agile approaches tend to have a number of characteristics. So they use key milestones for tracking progress, usually called iterations. They allow greater flexibility to build and tweak your detailed design throughout the project lifecycle. They allow the team to manage themselves within a boundary. They use objective measures alongside traditional subjective method analysis to improve progress reporting. Teams tend to work in shorter phases or iterations, and we tend to service progress at regular intervals. I've seen that a lot, and that adds some real value. Microsoft Dynamics can help with quite a bit of this because the inbuilt tools in Dynamics are geared towards it. So what is sorry, Microsoft Dynamics, Azure DevOps, apologies. So what is Azure DevOps? Well, it's a cloud-based application lifecycle management tool, usually abbreviated to ALM. It was developed to help manage the software development process, so it comes very much from the developer space. But it's evolved to include a great deal of a number of tools that are really, really useful for project management. So the tool is highly customizable. You can configure it to within an inch of your life. And there's a marketplace that provides additional tooling that you can plug into DevOps, which means that you can expand the use much more as well. It's a highly scalable tool. So my example shows quite a basic setup, but you can expand it to allow use by multiple teams, multiple team areas, and lots of other bits that go along with that. The tool is agile at its core, so all of the standard processes, which we'll talk about shortly, use Kanban boards, backlogs, and you can make use of the iteration planning functionality within DevOps. It's interesting just to note that, I don't know how many people will know this, probably you all will, but DevOps is actually being used now. So it's being used by your teams to manage development from a code perspective for Dynamics projects. It's also quite commonly used out in the customer base as well, because it's not a Dynamics tool, DevOps. As I mentioned, it comes from the development sphere, and it's quite widely used out in the industry by, for example, internal development teams at customers. So just for the ability to talk with around some kind of scenario, I just want to discuss the scenario that we've got. So as I mentioned, it's a very, very simple project that we're looking at here. We've got a single multifunctional team, a number of phases, with the build phase split into 3 separate iterations: CRP1, CRP2, and CRP3. And we'll be tracking risks, issues, and change requests within DevOps, which is something that you can do. So that provides a little bit of background as to the dashboard that the sandpit that I've created. And now I'll just go through some of the functionality and key features of DevOps with that as a background. So the first thing to talk about is dashboards. So DevOps comes with the ability to create powerful dashboards, which allow summarization of the project data into an easily consumable page. You create your own dashboards, and they're really, really intuitive and easy to create. You can have multiple dashboards per project. It's up to you how many you have and who has access to them. And they're made up generally of standard widgets, which are part of the product. And as I mentioned, there's a number of widgets that you can bring into your dashboard and use them from the marketplace as well. An example of that will be the Excel integration tool, which I'll show you a bit later. Dashboards are great because, well, for loads of reasons, but they help you to ease in new team members, I found. So people who don't necessarily understand or know DevOps at all, hopefully you can see from the example that I've got on screen, can have access to functionality without knowing the whole tool set. And when you integrate DevOps with teams, which you can do, and I'll show you, that makes things even easier, because you've got a single place for people to go from the project team, and they're not all over the place using different tools and such like. You can surface these dashboards to stakeholders if you want to, which allows you to give a good indication to, say, senior stakeholders of how the project is going, what the key issues are, etc. And I often use dashboards to create what I'll call pseudo boards. So some of the work items that are in Azure DevOps don't appear naturally on Kanban boards. Two terms I've just used there that I haven't described yet, but we'll go into those in a minute. But what you can do, and what I often do, if you look at the screen, if you look at the the red, amber, and green section, and we take issues, for example, I've got 3 query tiles there. One for issues that I haven't seen yet, and that need some attention. They're the red one. That's the red one. A tile for issues where those issues have been assigned for somebody to have a look at, which is the amber, or they're being worked on. The solution's been agreed and they're being worked on. And then a green tile for anything that is resolved or gone away. So in a way, to take those items that don't naturally occur on a board and to put it into a structure like that allows you to move things, although in a different way, across statuses. So just to go through some of the things on that dashboard, you can see I've got up in the top right hand corner the ability to create a new work item. I've put a widget in which just shows items that are assigned to me, and that'll be all different types of items. I've just discussed the red, amber, and green section, and down at the bottom we've got a commonly used chart here from Agile, which is a burn down chart. And that chart's showing me that on this particular iteration, although there's not a lot of work in there, I have to say, because I haven't put much in, you can see that we've got our available capacity in green, which decreases across the duration of the iteration. We've got our total scope, which is the total amount of work. We've got an ideal trend, which is basically reduces over the duration of the whole iteration, the total amount of work that needs to be done, and the remaining work highlighted in blue. I don't know whether you can probably see that. I don't know that it's not probably rendered quite small on your screens, but there you go. It's important to note that if you're going to use DevOps with LCS, you are required to use one of the standard process templates that DevOps provides. So there's a number of these. There's 4. There's the basic process, the agile process, the scrum process, and the CMMI process. And the differences between them are largely the language that they use, the item types that they surface and that you're able to use if you create a project of that type, and the transitions that those items take from new to closed. So if you look at the table that I've put up, you can see from a language perspective, if you're using a basic process, then the key deliverable for the team is an issue or issues. For Agile, it's user stories. For Scrum, it's PBIs, product backlog items. Those of you familiar with Scrum will be familiar with that term. For CMMI, we're talking about requirements. If we look at the types of items that you can actually use within the project process, you can see on one end, the basic process only has epics, issues, and tasks, whereas CNMI contains, well, you can use epics, features, requirements, tasks, bugs, issues, change requests, risks, reviews, and test cases. So I've talked a little bit about how customizable DevOps is. As I say, if you want to sync with LCS, then you can still do a lot of the customization, but you can't go too far away from one of these 4 template processes, otherwise the sync will stop working. Personally, I like the language in the Scrum process, but because it's handy to have issues, change requests, and risks in particular within the same project, we tend to use CNMI, and that generally works quite well. However, it does have its funnies, and because you're stuck with the template process, one of the funnies is state transitions, particularly for change requests, issues, and risks. So what I mean by state transitions is the preset flow that a work item takes, and it dictates how it gets from proposed to closed. And with CNMI, that's fairly prescriptive, and you can't change it, and it's not necessarily very intuitive. And therefore, it's one of the areas where if you're going to use this with a team, you need to make sure that they understand the process that you want to follow for each of these work items, and that it's used consistently. So that's transitions. I'll just pause slightly. Has anybody got any questions on anything that I've talked about up to now? I think I can't see.
There's no hands up yet, Steve.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll continue. Is my speed and everything, is that okay with everyone?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Carry on.
So the next thing to talk about is a cornerstone of DevOps, which is the backlog. So I'm going to show you on this slide a typical backlog, which is effectively a prioritized list of work that needs to be done on the project. Backlogs can exist at different levels. So you'll have a project backlog, which is all of the work items for the whole project. And then you'll pick items out of that to put into an iteration or sprint, which will form the basis of your sprint backlog. And so if you're looking from a project perspective, you look at the project backlog. If you're looking to do some work or interested in a sprint, then you'll be in your sprint backlog. It's really, really easy, again, and intuitive to review, update, and add to the project backlog. And there's lots of functionality in DevOps so that you can filter what it is that you're looking at. And while I am here, I'm feeling confident, I'll try and show you that. So I've actually just flipped over into DevOps itself, into our sandpit, so you can see the dashboard there that I've just been talking about. If I go into backlogs, a couple of things to just mention. So you can see backlogs in terms of epics or features or requirements. So you can see each individual level as you see fit. You can also see it as a tree. So you can see all of the items in there, and that looks a little bit like the slide that I've just shown you. And if you're interested in navigating, or particularly if you're interested in filtering, to hone in into a specific item. You've got several options. You can use a text filter. You can filter by type or multiple types if you wish. Who items are assigned to. States of items. And I'll just mention tags. So tags are interesting because tags are a really good way to flag up items with certain characteristics so that you can either filter on those characteristics or you can run reports based on those. So you can see in here, I've just used some examples of tags for level 1, 2, and 3 processes. I've tagged some of the requirements as dev, some as config. So yeah. So back to the presentation. So the next thing I'll talk about are the work items themselves. So in the backlog's obviously made up of a number of work items of different types. If you click on one of those, then you go into a form which gives you the details of the individual work item. And in here, I've just shown 2 types. They're all pretty similar, and they all behave in a very similar way in lots of ways. But the form that you get and the items that you get to play with on the form will be dependent upon the type of work item that you're actually working with. So you can see that a requirement is different to a risk, for example. But common elements are, well, you can assign team members to work items. You can maintain the state of a work item, that state and reason. You can describe the item using text, and as I've just mentioned, some predefined fields depending upon which type of work item it is that you're looking at. You can generally estimate workload. A really interesting feature in work items is the discussions field. So hopefully you can see on the top requirement screen there that I'm showing, there's a brief discussion. Now, discussions are a way that your team can have a conversation about a work item and build up a rich history of the point at which you're at, if you like. You can also make use of the @ symbol in those discussions, and if you use that, that will actually send a notification email to the person who you've referenced, so that they know to come and have a look at a question that you've asked them and give you a response, or indeed you can just, ask people to come and have a look at this work item just generally. You can attach documents to work items as well. So an example might be if you have a requirement which is a development requirement, you may want to create a TDD in a Word document, and you may want to attach that document to the work item as opposed to just using some text. And there's loads of flexibility in that, so it depends how you run your project, but you can put those attachments up there. You can also, another piece of functionality which is quite powerful, is that you can link between work items. So you have the traditional links which you would have seen in the backlog board, which is a parent and child link, but you can also link off in lots of other ways. So it might just be a general link to remind you that when you're working on a particular requirement, that you need to consider this other requirement, and that goes in a link, or that can go into a link in your work item, which is really quite useful. And one of the key things with linking, I guess, is to do with your development team. So as your development team are actually creating change sets and code builds, they can reference in their code the work items that have led to that work, so that you're building up you know, a history of what's been done in terms of development, and also why that's been done. So that can be quite a useful thing. I mentioned before, and I'll just mention again, the number of work items that you get and the types of work items that you get are very much dependent upon the process that you select when you create your project. You can add additional work items, but as I've mentioned, you have to be a bit careful that you don't break the sync with LCS if you're using LCS. So Kanban boards are another really good feature of DevOps. Kanban boards allow you to manage the state of work items by moving them across a board effectively. Anybody who's seen Scrum will know what a Scrum board looks like. They're basically a different way to visualize the backlog that we saw earlier. So previously you could go in and you could update a status, but it's much nicer and more intuitive and easier to move cards across a board to update a status. Using Kanban boards is quite configurable, and I have used in the past the configuration of these boards to good effect. You can, I'll give you some examples. So you can add columns into your board to match your particular process. So in the past, I've used epic and feature boards to track project readiness. So, for example, in the slide, if you look at the top board that I've got on there, you'll see that we've got statuses of proposed, planning, building, testing, resolved, and closed at the level of feature. And within those features, you've got a number of requirements, and you can see the second board down is showing a completely different process for the requirements, which is just proposed, active, resolved, and closed. So the scenario might be that your functional team are tracking requirements, are tracking your features across the whole project from proposed through build to closed, whilst your build team, your developers perhaps, or your functional consultants who are doing configuration are tracking the requirements and the workload at that level. So it's just quite a nice configurable tool. The other thing you can do is you can customize the cards. So the cards being the representation of the work items on the board, so the little cards that you can see. You can do quite a lot with those. So the key things you can do is you can add additional fields. Now, if you're tracking work remaining against task items, then it's quite useful to put work remaining on the card so that when people are doing their review, they can update that field as they go. You can give tags a color. So I mentioned tags earlier. If you've got development work and you've got config work and data migration work, which you clearly would have, you can actually tag those three types of item with a tag, and you can give tags a color as well. So I don't know how easy that is to see on the middle board there, but I've colored dev in green, data migration as red, and configuration as blue. So it just gives a bit of an indication as to what you could do there. You can also add swim lanes onto boards, and you can see for our requirements board, I've actually created a blocked swim lane. They don't do too much, they're mainly visual, but what I've done there is I've moved a particular requirement into the blocked swim lane just to indicate that requirement is currently blocked and to draw attention to the fact. And the other thing that I've done to draw attention to that item is that I have put some conditional formatting on the cards as well, so that any item that is flagged as blocked actually comes up as red. So just to give you an idea of the kind of things that you can do. And just a point of learning is that whilst features, for example, features and requirements are parents and children, there's no automation between the two sets of boards. So if you close a feature, it doesn't automatically have an impact. Sorry, if you close a requirement, it doesn't automatically impact the features board, so it doesn't roll up necessarily. That's not always a bad thing. And the slightly different board there, because it shows two different types of work item, is the task board, which I'll just show you now. So the task board is a special type of Kanban board that allows you to plan and update sprints. The process might be that after you've defined your requirements, you can go through your requirements and assign them to sprints or iterations. You can then plan out those sprints individually, and you can use some capacity tooling, which allows you to add constraints to help you plan capacity by person, even by person by discipline. And it allows you to specify individual or team days off within a sprint. So by configuring that stuff up as part of your sprint planning, what you're doing is you're setting a capacity over the duration of the sprint, so that then as you're adding work and assigning work to individual people, you can see where maybe you're assigning too much work, or indeed where you've run out of capacity and you need to stop. Once the sprint's agreed as part of your sprint planning, and you've got your iteration with all of the various requirements and tasks assigned within it, then you use the same board essentially for your team to manage their individual tasks by moving them across the board and recording the hours remaining on each of the tasks that they've got, and that then feeds into your burn down chart. Just some points to mention with tasks. You can actually now have a requirement that has a number of tasks, and those tasks or child tasks can be split across multiple sprints. It doesn't seem perhaps like an important thing, but if, for example, in sprint 1 you want to create all of your technical design documents for dev, and in sprint 2 you want to do the development, it's quite useful to be able to break a requirement into two tasks, the TDD and the requirements, and put those into different iterations. So that's quite an interesting thing that you can do. Yeah, and just to mention again, you can actually set your capacity constraints by person, by type of work. I don't think I've ever used type of work. I think it may be a little bit overkill for me, but it's just interesting functionality if indeed you would want to use that. The queries are really powerful within DevOps. So they allow you to build select statements that return lists of work items to help you manage a project. Once you've built a query, you can persist or save it. You can share those queries, or you can keep them to yourself. As you build in a query, you get direct access to the results. So you can see the results panel at the bottom of the top screen there. If I was to click on risk 1, risk 2, risk 3, I'd go straight through into the risk form, and I'd be able to edit that risk. You also use queries for a lot of your widgets and charts. So the process would be to build a query first and then to link that to a widget. So for example, the query tabs that I had initially on the dashboard that I showed you earlier, showing the number of new risks, for example, that would be linked to a query called new risks that I've created and shared. It's interesting to note that you can create different types of queries. It's quite powerful. So the query you can see there is just a flat query, and it just gives you a flat list of work items. But you can also use or return a tree of work items. From a query, so you can see a result set similar to what we saw in the backlog board earlier. So you've got a hierarchy, and that can be quite useful if you want to add child items and you're using the Excel integration tool. But there you go. So as I've mentioned several times, DevOps is very, very configurable. You can switch features on and off. You can set up multiple teams and grow your project, so it's how adding different elements. You can define all manner of releases and iterations and patterns, from a flat iteration pattern to a hierarchical release and iteration pattern. You can make use of powerful security configuration, which I'm not going to show, but it's there. The security configuration within DevOps is quite powerful. You can configure notifications, set up multiple bespoke dashboards. You can personalize your Kanban boards, and you can build your own queries. You can also integrate into different applications within the Microsoft suite, which I'm going to show now. But just to share some learning just generally on DevOps, I've seen some very complex setups, and I find that where setups are really, really complex, teams who aren't technical often find it difficult to use, and if they don't use it, then and you're relying on it for progress reports, and then you can run into some difficulties. So my recommendation, if you're starting to use this tool, is to use it start off as simple as possible, and then only to add complication where you really, really need it. So DevOps integrates with a number of tools, and Power Automate makes it, opens that up even more. But I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple of the interesting ones from my perspective. I'm going to talk about the integration into LCS, in particular BPM, Business Process Modeler. Talk a little bit about the Excel integration, which I mentioned earlier. It integrates really, really nicely into Teams, which I'll just show briefly. Also, there's also a connector into for Power Platform. So particularly for Power BI and Power Automate, there's potential use cases. I'm not sure of the use cases for Power Apps, so I haven't really talked about that too much, but the other two are quite interesting. And it also integrates into Project Online, which seems to me a fledgling integration, something that might be more useful as that develops, I suspect. Okay, so I'll talk about the integration with lifecycle services, and in particular BPM. So the setup. So if you are using lifecycle services and Business Process Modeler to define your master processes and your process list and your requirements, you can set up an integration between that tool and DevOps. You can also sync test cases if you're recording test recordings and saving them up to BPM. But we covered that in the last session, so I'm not going to
catch that.
talk about that. That'll be silly, sorry. So I'm not really going to talk about that particularly. The process is relatively straightforward. So you need to connect DevOps to LCS using an access token, which you get from DevOps. And then you need to configure item mappings between BPM and DevOps. So you have to link from a level 1, 2, 3 item and your requirements to the DevOps work items that you want them to be when they come across. And you've got some flexibility in there, but you can see how I would tend to do it. After a bit of trial and error, that seems to work out best for me, using multiple layers of epics and features. And when you get down to brass tacks requirements, you can't create necessarily with CMMI, you can't create tasks from the business process modeler, but that doesn't really matter. It's something to be played around with. So just some things to consider. The synchronization means that if you want to get some meaningful reporting, it's best if you can keep your business processes mapped to a consistent number of levels. It's interesting to note that you can link several BPM libraries to the same DevOps project. And what it actually does is it adds a square bracketed prefix to all of your work items with the name of the project library, the BPM library, the source BPM library. And you don't need to be using BPM diagrams, because people have varied opinions on those, to make use of BPM and the integration. Effectively, if you do use Business Process Modeler to keep your list of processes, it's kind of centralized list that allows you to fire up task recordings, your requirements. You might do some Visio process flows. It's just a nice handy place to keep things. So I don't think there's anything much more to say about this, other than the sync process itself it can be done manually. And last time I checked, it does periodically do a sync as well in the background. So a little bit about the Excel integration, which I mentioned before. You can actually export work items to a CSV file, but if you want to integrate Excel with DevOps in a similar fashion to how you might integrate Excel into Dynamics 365 so that you can make changes, you require an additional extension from the marketplace, which is the Azure DevOps in Excel extension. And you'd also need to add an Azure DevOps add-in to your Microsoft Office to Excel. You get that as part of Visual Studio, but you can also get it separately. And as I mentioned earlier, the integration can be quite useful if you want to do mass updates to work items, or you want to add them through Excel, or maybe through some VBA or something like that. In terms of the integration into the Power Platform, and in particular Power BI, there are built-in connections. For Power BI, it only allows you to report on boards. So, as I mentioned earlier, DevOps itself has got a much wider remit than just boards for code management, pipelines, etc. You can only actually report through Power BI on our work items that we've been discussing. So it's great for the project management elements. I personally feel that you get most of the information, or you can get most of the information that you need from dashboards within DevOps, but I can see use cases where Power BI may be useful, particularly if you want to obtain information from multiple data sources. So you might want to look at budgeting alongside work item information or whatnot. So that's that. I mentioned earlier that the integration into Project Online. There seems to be a bit of a move by Microsoft to allow you to visualize a portfolio of projects within Project Online, and allow you to mix and match project tooling. So if you create a roadmap in Project Online, you can actually put rows in to show key dates and progress for DevOps projects alongside Microsoft project, typical Microsoft projects. But to be honest, it seems a bit embryonic to me. I don't know whether anybody's used it in any capacity and is getting some good use out of it. But to me, it's a little bit simplistic. It's a little bit new, and it looks like something that might be useful going forward, but at the moment, it doesn't provide an awful lot. Well, that's my 2 pence worth anyway. So just to talk a little on more about the Power Platform. DevOps does integrate with Power Automate, which gives you quite a lot of options, I guess. There's a number of standard triggers if you want to build your own flows. Some of them are useful for reporting on work items. Others are to do with change requests, pull requests, mainly looking at Git as it happens, which is useless to us anyway because we don't use Git with D365. There's around about 50 pre-built flows which you can go through. They tend to be grouped into flows that are triggered by Outlook that create work items in your DevOps environment. Flows which will create items in other applications when you create an item in DevOps. So, for example, there's one in there that allows you to set up the creation of a SharePoint list item every time you create a work item in DevOps. And there's also the type of communication flows as well. So a good example of that might be you can set up a flow to send an update on all open work items for an employee to a manager on a Friday or something like that. I personally am not sure I've come up with a really good use case for that, but for Power Automate particularly, I can see some good ideas, but whether you use them, I don't really know. It'd be interesting to know if anybody else has. I mentioned the integration with Teams earlier, and now I think that's got some real legs because it allows your team to go to, continues to use Teams, and that gives you access to everything, including your communication, all your files, data, your posts, other applications, but also you can surface DevOps through Teams as well. It allows you to give access to multiple of the boards, the Kanban boards. You just have different tabs within the channel. It gives you and you can also set it up so any notifications that are generated, any changes to any work items will also appear as posts on the channel board. But when I've done that, it does create a lot of noise and kind of waters down the channel, to be honest. So I wouldn't really advise doing that. But of course, there's always a case where that would be useful. So I've got some questions for you guys if anybody's interested in helping me out with them. But also, I'd like to open up and just, has anybody got any questions on this kind of stuff that I've talked about? It's quite a difficult topic because it's so big, and this kind of presentation is a little dry. So apologies for that. But yeah, anybody got any ideas on the questions that I presented, or any questions that they want to ask me?
Michael, have you got a question?
No, you asked for a scenario where to use Power Automate, and I was just giving an example.
Yeah. Can you see that, Steve?
I can't see anything as it happens.
No, I can tell you. So we have a customer that's actually using Jira for all of their IT projects, and the customer has asked us to do an integration because they want to, do a portfolio of all their tasks in Jira, but in the project we will be working within DevOps. But so it's more for their internal overview of all tasks across their people.
Oh, okay. And do you guys use DevOps for project management generally outside of development, or do you?
Yeah, we use it for everything. We actually use it all the way from analysis phase, and throughout the execution phase.
Brilliant.
Well, Steve, I think Michael and the guys at Scales presented on DevOps a couple of years ago when we had the Impact conference in Amsterdam. Okay. In the good old days when we used to have a few beers and things like that. Yeah.
I must admit, that would be nice.
Who says we aren't having beers right now?
True.
Well, I just I don't know if you can see that.
Cheers, Steve.
Yeah, cheers. It's actually Beck's Blue, so there you go.
I'm gonna have to wait till they get home. Just a matter of interest is sort of, does everybody on this call sort of use DevOps? Is everybody using DevOps, or probably put it another way, is there anybody that's not using DevOps? Show of hands.
So, Martin Wenzel speaking. We are using DevOps, but we have a little issue. Many of our customers have a habit to handle some paper documents for acceptance purpose. How do you guys solve this issue? How you generate printed documents with the scope of the project from the DevOps to the paper form?
Oh, so what? I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. My fault. When you say the scope of the project, do you mean a list of the work items, or do you mean something different to that?
Yes, the list of work items, the description of processes, configuration deliverables, and other things that are usually kept as a work item in the DevOps. And the customer wants to have the printed documents to sign in sign this document and acceptance as an output of the project, not just the result as a code and so on, but also customer wants some documentation.
Yeah, that sounds, if I'm understanding correctly, that sounds like a good, valid use case for Power BI and a report that you could potentially build. From that, does that sound reasonable, or have I misunderstood completely? So, sorry. So I'm assuming that you could provide a Power BI report on any of the work items, include states, completions, and all that kind of stuff in a report.
Yeah, it's a good output for project meetings and so on, or some reports for stakeholders. It's okay, but at the beginning of the project, there is some statement of work, and we have delivered the Dynamics 365 with the covered requirements, and we also have to deliver documentation as how the requirements are filled by customization. How about configuration, each customization, or even the fit? And we usually keep it inside the DevOps as work items.
Yeah.
In the structures form with the epic and features and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to make clear that we already deliver all what is inside scope of work and agreement and so on. So the printed document is a crucial in our business, and we are trying to use some tools, for example, extended reports for DevOps to generate Word documents or PDF documents.
Yeah.
Or we use the Word to VTS. This is tool from ATA company, but these tools are not very friendly.
Yeah.
It's not the great, and there is a lot of work to adapt the tools for our purpose to fit output to the professional form. And I'm looking for some easier way how to generate the reports from DevOps that looks professional and could be generate in a minute.
Yeah.
In fact, the Excel integration might help.
The problem with the Excel in the integration is that you can't get the like the contents, the body of the work items, and especially not the rich text. So I agree. Yeah. It's I don't think there's an easy way to extract all this, other than to use the tools that you mentioned, or simply print all the documents.
Yeah.
I think the DevOps is more made as a collaboration tool. So, you know, you can't do a baseline of this is the scope for the project, because everyone can go in and edit everything. I think that's one of the shortcomings here, is that you have to rely on each other. Everyone can adjust or edit everything. Obviously, you have an audit trail, but I mean, you can't keep a baseline. You can't just do a baseline and say this is the scope that we are working from.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the difficulties with working, generally speaking, in a more agile fashion over a more structured fashion, isn't it? So I guess it's not only inherent in the tool itself, but also in the more agile approach, I guess.
No, okay. It's still a challenge.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I'm sorry, I can't speak to any tools that I personally have used to resolve the challenge. So it might be worth throwing that open to, I don't know if there's any more technical people. Is there any other way to get that kind of information out? I don't know if anybody on the call has got any ideas on that.
This is Michael again. Sorry. So I will ask. We are running a project which is in it's a medical company, so medical devices. So they have to document everything. I'll check with them to see if they have done anything and they found anything, and then I'll get back to see with what they find, what they have come up with.
That'll be really useful.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, Michael, if you can feed that back to me, then I can feed it back to all the people
Sure.
that joined the group today.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't know that anybody else is asking any questions, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Paul, but
Yeah, you won't steal my thunder, Steve. Don't you worry about that.
So I just wanted to say thanks for listening to my somewhat dry presentation. It's quite difficult circumstances to do this to a screen. So if only we had beers and we were sat around the table, it would be much better, I think. I'm available if anybody's got any further questions after the session or whatever, if anyone wants to reach out.
Well, thanks, Steve. I mean, after the first session, there was a couple of questions that people sent over to me, and I forwarded that on to Lau, who did the presentation. So again, if you think of anything you want to ask over the weekend or anything like that, then forward that on to me, and I'll get in touch with you, Steve, and between us we can answer the question.
Perfect.
Okay, so yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for your time and sharing your knowledge and experience with us this afternoon. And thank you all for attending. Don't forget the next session is on the 5th of February, when we're going to be looking at BPM. Like I say, if you've got any other questions, forward those on to me, and between myself, Keith and Steve, we'll be able to get the answer for you. Thank you very much, and there's no other questions. Have a great weekend.